Now, I hand over the floor now to James to help us unpack all what David has started to raise as topics. Please, you have the floor, James.
Thank you very much, Felix, and thank you also, David. I agree with many of the things that you have just said. I think it's fair to say that the international environment has become far more volatile and unpredictable, perhaps even more so than during phases of the Cold War. I think it's fair to say that we are now facing threats from multiple different vectors, particularly from Russia, of course, in relation to Ukraine. And I completely and wholeheartedly agree with what David was saying there. Europeans in particular have to step up and provide the support that Ukraine requires to defeat Russia and to throw it out of the country. Otherwise, we will face Pandora's box. And I don't think really we've fully understood the extent to which the Russians will continue to challenge the European order, particularly if they prevail in any way in Ukraine. And there are many different ways that this could occur. Now, Russia, of course, is one dimension of this, but there's also many others. And at least in British strategic circles, a new idea is coming to the fore of what's being called the CRINC. That's to say the alignments that are occurring between Russia, China, Iran and North Korea, which have been brought to the fore, particularly by the war in, or Russia's war in Ukraine. So there has been a lot of discussion on this over recent years, and sometimes it's been a little hysterical or even a little too forward. There's been discussion of a dragon bear, the taking shape of a dragon bear. But I think it's fair to say that in relation to Ukraine, we really have seen the emergence of coordination between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And that in some ways, this is being brought about through Russia's failures, its strategic failures to secure its initial objectives in 2022, and the fact that the war is now in its third year and continues to drag on, where Russia is not succeeding in the way that it had hoped. But nonetheless, these alignments are occurring. We are seeing Chinese support for Russia. We are seeing Iranian drones being used by Russia. And we have also seen, of course, North Korean troops being deployed to assist Russia in defending its own territories. So the threat is extreme, and it's also in Europe. So the ideas that we had in the 1990s and the 2000s. Remember the European security strategy and the idea that we would need to be able to deploy beyond Europe to take on the major security challenges. This is increasingly archaic, and we need to face reality, and that is that many other actors are coming to Europe, and in some ways you could even say that this conflict, particularly the conflict in Ukraine, of course, is an extension of the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific, and that we need to understand the connectivities between the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific and vice versa. We need to understand that in Europe. The Americans need to understand it more than perhaps they have. And also our friends and partners in the Indo-Pacific need to understand that as well. So that is why, for example, when Lord Robertson, who has been running our strategic defence review, described the alignment between the four countries as a so-called deadly quartet, and I think British strategy or British thinking has been gradually orientating to understand the extent to which these four actors are aligning and the threat that they pose to us across the international order. So this then brings us to Europe itself. So Europe, including the UK here, faces some significant challenges. Beyond the external ones, it also we also face a set of internal challenges. For example, our domestic economic power base has declined substantially in the world over recent years. There's been much talk about Western decline, but the decline primarily has not been the United States. It still retains around 20 to 25% of global economic output. And in some ways, it's even grown in terms of the advanced tech sector. It's regained energy autonomy in a way that most of its allies and partners haven't. The two key areas of the world to have faced relative decline over the last 20 years are Europe and Japan. And Europe's has been quite profound. To give a couple of statistics, in 2005, the US economy was only 10% larger than the EU's economy. Today in 2020, it's actually 50% larger. So, there's quite a substantial power shift underway within the West. and it's one that we really need to get to grips with if we are to continue to play a role that will underpin our own security and defense. And added to this, of course, is the fact that the Americans want us to step up and expect us to do more. And I think we're now facing a US administration which is more decisive and determined on this issue than any in many years, including the first Trump administration from 2016 until 2020. There are also some other issues. For example, there are a number of internal divisions within Europe, both within the EU and, of course, beyond it. Some of these divisions have, I think, rescinded since the Russian reinvasion of Ukraine. There were some disagreements in terms of how to deal with Russia. There have been disagreements between the UK and the EU. There have been disagreements within the EU between countries such as Hungary and others, which have maybe tacked slightly independent courses, or even ones which are more friendlier towards countries such as Russia. And then there are those that have embraced far more resolute stances, such as those in the Baltic and also in Northern Europe. And then there are, I think, a number of kind of geopolitical fantasies which we need to overcome. Those whereby we've seen the world with rather rose-tinted spectacles, and we need to come to terms with the new realities and adapt accordingly. So what can we do, and what particularly can the UK and the EU do together? So I think there are a number of different things that we need to tackle head on. David mentioned Ukraine, of course. That must be perhaps the central one, because, as I said at the beginning, if Ukraine fails or if Russia prevails, then Pandora's box, I think, truly will open. So we need to increase our defense spending. We need to increase the extent to which we coordinate within Europe, particularly to take care of issues that are on Europe's periphery, or even in this case, quite central to Europe. We also need to ramp up defense industrial coordination, but also defense industrial output. So we require more funding for this. We probably need to think quite ambitiously, but also cleverly about how a new alignment might take place between the EU, the UK, and other important actors such as Norway. So maybe we need to think a bit about some kind of European coalition which might draw all of those actors in and allow us to respond decisively to threats or challenges that are around us. And I think there's also another issue that we need to think about, and that is how do we kind of push back in terms of the cultural and economic dimension of power in areas in the so-called middle ground states. For example, how could we coordinate our aid delivery programs more effectively? Europeans are now giving something in the region of $100 billion per year between them. How could we coordinate this money more effectively and deliver it so that it adds up to more than its mere parts, to be a coordinated pushback against the likes of Russia and China when they seek to take advantage of the international order wherever they think it might be weakest. So there's a lot to do, but with the ambition and the determination and an acknowledgement of the sheer risks that face us, I think it might be possible to succeed.
Thank you very much, James. You touched upon a few rather vital points in terms of practicalities, what needs to be done. And of course, the EU is trying to get its house into order. But before we enter the discussions, please let me remind the audience, if you have any questions, please pop them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen.